This is a list of my favorite gear of 2023, stuff that I use to make these amazing YouTube videos. Not everything on this list came out this year, but it's all stuff that I either purchased or otherwise acquired in 2023. Everything except for one item I actually purchased myself. So obviously this all has my full recommendation as things that I went out and bought with my money, except for one item. And of course, I'll make sure that you know what that is. In order to meet the mostly arbitrary criteria of this video, something that elevated my work above what I was able to accomplish before, and or something that made what I was doing easier, more streamlined, etc. Number one, in no particular order, is the Zeppin Micro Slider 3. It took me years before I finally pulled the trigger on a slider. Something that I always wanted to get, but just couldn't. I don't know, there was always something else that was more interesting or that I thought I would like to have more than a slider. The Zeppin Micro Slider was the one that I ended up going with because it's relatively affordable. It has lots of great features. It's well regarded and well reviewed. And it's like something that you could probably grow with over time. So mine has the motor. You can basically, program it to slide back and forth at various distances, at various speeds, but it doesn't have the panning and tilting head. So that's something that I could get in the future if I wanted to. One of the concerns, I was like, is this gonna be long enough? But a little bit goes a long way, especially for doing product shots. You don't need a super long move to get enough movement. So, and this is also where wide angle lenses come into play. Wide angle lens will exaggerate the amount of movement in a shot. One thing that I didn't quite anticipate, you can see that it has legs that you can extend and then obviously place this onto a surface. But what you'll find is if you're doing product shots, which are also on that surface, you have the height of the slider itself, and then you've got a video head on it, and then you've got your camera. So at this point, your camera is well elevated above the surface. What I've had to do is use a tripod so I can get it at the level of the surface or even below, because if you're shooting at a kind of a low angle, stuff looks more epic. But you have to have a pretty solid, pretty beefy tripod in order to support the weight, especially if the camera starts getting out over here. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking about getting a slider. Number two, in no particular order, is the Rodecaster Duo. I had the original Rodecaster Pro for many years, but I kind of stopped using it because it was really overkill for me, and it was just kind of big and bulky and in the way a lot of times. So I ended up using most often the Audient Evo 4. The reason I got the Rodecaster Duo is because there's processing that's built into this interface. So it can be used as a USB audio interface to interface with your computer. So basically taking a microphone signal or some kind of audio signal and then putting it into your computer for you to do things with magically. But it's also a standalone mixing unit, so you don't even need to connect it to a computer. You can record directly to this thing. And as such, it has the ability to add processing to the signal right in that. So that's not something new to the Duo. That was something you could do in the Rodecaster Pro, but they just improved a lot of the processing and given you more capabilities. One of the most important things for me as I started to do more and more live streams was the ability to add an EQ. My sound would have some processing, some EQ, some compression coming right into the live stream. Now you can do some of that depending on what live streaming software you're using. I use OBS, and there are some plugins built into OBS, and you can add third-party plugins, but it just makes it a lot simpler. It doesn't really require any processing power from your computer to do any of that on the back end. You can just do it right into the Rodecaster Duo. Some of the other improvements over the Evo 4, for instance, is it has so much more gain. And I was using the Shure SM7B, and as you may or may not know, that is a very quiet microphone. It needs a lot of gain in order to get a good signal from. You'll often be using some kind of mic activator with it. You don't need that anymore with the Rodecaster Duo. It has like 70 dB of gain. The Audient Evo 4 only has about 50 dB of gain, and 50 is kind of like the minimum threshold for something like the SM7B. There's a lot of stuff that this thing can do that I haven't even scratched the surface of. So that's another really cool thing about it, is it's going to grow. It's the kind of thing that can grow with you over time, and you can take more and more advantage of it as you kind of expand your horizons. One of the negatives that I've run into kind of immediately is that the headphone preamps are still not very good. That was a knock on the original Rodecaster Pro and something that apparently isn't really improved on the Rodecaster Duo. Just using it to monitor your stream or your podcast, it's mostly fine, although it can be irritating when you're listening and hearing some hiss essentially. You don't necessarily know, is that coming from my microphone or is that coming from the headphones? It's probably coming from the headphones. But if you wanted to use this as an interface for your computer as an audio source, like if you just want to listen to headphones, like if you're editing a video, it's not really good for that either because you're going to be hearing some noise out of those headphones. So that's unfortunate. Next, in no particular order, is the GVM SD650 Pro bicolor COB LED light. The GVM SD650 Pro is the name of it. All the other stuff is basically what it is. That is over here as my key light right now. This is the one product on this list that was sent to me for review. Everything else that I'm going to talk about, or I've already talked about, are things that I bought myself. So the GVM SD650 Pro is a big ass LED COB light. It's bicolor. You can battle the sun. And the reason that this is on the list is it just is so versatile. Where it's become useful for me is I've done a lot more macro shots this year. And what I didn't really understand prior to experimenting is that you kind of need to stop down a macro lens quite a bit, because if you have it wide open or have a relatively large aperture, the depth of field is so shallow that nothing but a minor little, like kind of a little sliver is going to be in focus. If you're filming something or photographing something that's relatively flat, that's fine because that's all that needs to be in focus. But anytime you add some depth into the shot, then you really need to have a deeper depth of field because you can literally see that little sliver of focus. I've found that I've often needed to stop down to as much as f8 or f11 to get the shot that I want. And you're going to need a lot of light, especially if you're shooting in log and you want to overexpose by a stop or two in order to get the cleanest image. So having a light like this is much more necessary than I anticipated it being. I also like to shoot with a window a lot of times, and in order to get a proper exposure, not blow out the window, you're going to need to essentially expose for that window, and then if you expose for the window, the rest of your room is likely going to be very dark until you start adding in light, and you're going to need a lot of it in order to get proper exposure. It is expensive. I think this is about $1,000, but if you compare it to other 650 watt lights, it's usually about half as much as something from Aperture and Nanlite. Those lights tend to have more weather sealing and are just a little bit beefier and more professional, but this is a very well-built aluminum. All the cabling is super robust and thick. So this is a pretty robust light too. It's just really meant for studio work and not for outdoor work, which is another use case for such a powerful light, but this isn't really well suited for that unless it's a nice weather day. The only downside of this one is just that it's really big and really heavy. You're gonna want a big beefy stand, whether that's a C stand or a combo stand. It's also very cumbersome to move around, and I often hurt myself trying to move it.
You're supposed to be like, oh my God, it's so heavy.
So lift with your legs and not your back. An honorable mention, something that just occurred to me as I was sitting down to record this video, is this microphone. This is the Earthworks Ethos, and it is a broadcast style microphone really meant for voiceover, podcasting, live streaming, that kind of stuff. And the reason I like it so much is it's a condenser microphone. Most microphones in this category are dynamic mics like the SM7B and tend to require a lot of gain. This one, being a condenser mic, requires power and therefore doesn't require anywhere near as much gain. I also really like the way this microphone looks, and more importantly, I really like the way this microphone sounds. If you've always wanted to get an SM7B but been put off by the whole process of, do I need a cloud lifter? What else do I need? Maybe take a look at this one. And they're the same price. So it's definitely one worth taking a look at if you've always been looking at an SM7B. Next is the Sony FX30. I'm using the FX30 to film this video. I got this camera, I think, around April of this year, mostly to make content about because I knew it was a very popular camera that people wanted to know about. I made tons of videos, and it's actually kind of improved my knowledge and abilities as a videographer just by getting to know this camera, in particular, the Cine EI mode. So that's cool. Thank you, FX30. Other than that, I've just really enjoyed using this camera much more than I thought I would. I'm not someone who gets super hung up on the whole full frame versus APS-C and that whole sensor debate. I think each sensor has kind of an interesting quality to it that can be taken advantage of with intentionality. It's just a workhorse camera. And for me, that's just been kind of as a studio camera, as a YouTube production camera. That means that I can just have it on and running for hours and hours and hours and not worry about it overheating. As long as it's plugged into power. Obviously the battery would drain. For anybody who's doing live events, another important component of that is that it has dual card slots, whether that's dual SD or dual CF Express or a combination of those two things. And that can be used either as a redundant recording, which might be important, or as relay recordings. I have the XLR top handle, which I've really enjoyed using. I'm recording audio through that currently. Coming back to that theme of, something that makes your life easier, more streamlined, you can obviously record good audio in a separate audio device, but that requires the setup of a separate device. That's going to require syncing of your audio in post, whereas you can get a really high quality audio signal right into the camera. You can use microphones like this Earthworks Ethos plugged right into that audio handle. It's been rock solid in terms of autofocus and just really no complaints. The lenses obviously are interchangeable on the bigger cameras, the full frame and the APS-C cameras. I like the fact that I can just use my full frame lenses right on the FX30. So let's talk about lenses. The first one is the Sony 15mm f1.4 G lens that I'm using to film this video. I recently got this one, and it's mostly been for its intended use case, which has an alternate angle for my YouTube videos. It would probably be a good idea for me to, at some point, just kind of pick an angle and pick a set and just stick with it. I like to tinker and try different setups, and it's just fun for me and it keeps it interesting. So on APS-C, a 15 is a 22.5 equivalent. So it's a little bit wider than 24, but basically in that ballpark. And having an f1.4 not only means it can gather in a ton of light, so if you need it for that, but it also means that you have a pretty shallow depth of field for such a wide lens on an APS-C camera. So the equivalent is around an f2.1, I believe, and you can see the result here. I'm at 1.4. I'm actually probably another arm's length away from the front of the camera. So if I were to get it a little bit closer, you could get even more shallow depth of field if that's what you're looking for. It has an aperture ring that's clicky and declicky, and the manual focus is linear. It is compatible with focus breathing compensation, although this lens doesn't have much, if any, focus breathing anyway, so it's not even necessary. But if you want to enable that focus breathing compensation, you'll get more like a 24mm field of view. It's super lightweight. It's very compact, just a nice little lens to have for sure. The next lens is the Sigma 50mm f1.4 art lens. It took me a couple years before I went out and got a 50. I didn't want to spend the G Master money on a 50mm, so I got the Sigma version instead. And this is quite a bit less expensive than the Sony G Master f1.4, and it's obviously way less money than the f1.2. And it is good enough for me. Let's just talk about the downsides. So it has a considerable amount of focus breathing, and it's not going to be compatible with focus breathing compensation. So if that's a consideration or that's really important to you, then you probably want to go ahead and look at the Sony lenses. Number two is it's not super well performing, I think, at f1.4, but it's good enough. I was working on a video testing out a variable ND filter, so I wanted to use this lens at f1.4 wide open outdoors. It looks pretty good. It looks sharp enough because I was filming people. It's okay if the lens is a little bit softer, I think, if you're filming people. I didn't notice any like crazy chromatic aberration and that kind of stuff. But those are things that you're definitely going to look out for with this lens if you really want to use f1.4 a lot. Okay, and one more lens, the Sony 70-200 f4 Macro G version 2. Earlier this year, and I can't even remember why, I was interested in trying out the 70-200 f2.8 G Master version 2, so I rented that lens for a week and fell in love with it. I thought it was an amazing, almost magical lens. Something about the image quality from that lens was just I just thought it was amazing. But I just could not justify spending that much money on a 70-200, which is a focal length that I wouldn't take advantage of enough to justify that price. So I ended up getting the f4G2, but the macro functionality of this one makes it much more usable as a studio lens as well. I can do product B-roll using that G Master. It does have pretty close focus for a 70-200, but it's not anywhere on the level of this one. It's not a true one-to-one macro unless you combine it with a teleconverter, but even without that, the macro is macro enough. I have the Sigma 105mm macro for Sony. As I talked about, you have to stop down so much in order to get enough depth of field in your shot that this lens, you have to back up a little bit so you can't get as close as that Sigma, and that also increases your depth of field. So with the Sigma, if you're stopping down to like f8 to f11, with this one, you can probably stop down, you could be wide open at f4 or maybe f5.6. So you don't need as much light for one. And, the working distance is just a little bit more manageable, I think. This is obviously much cheaper than the f2.8 G Master, of course, but it's also much smaller and lighter. Even though the barrel does extend, that's probably pretty close to the size of the f2.8. I don't know that this has that magical quality of the G Master, and that's not something that I can really objectively quantify, but the image out of this is really good anyway. It's super sharp. It might even be sharper than the G Master. In terms of the bokeh capabilities of f2.8 versus f4, I mean, obviously there's a difference, but if you are zoomed out to 135 to 200 millimeters, f4 is going to give you plenty of shallow depth of field. When I was testing out that G Master, I was shooting oftentimes at f7 to f11 and still getting plenty of shallow depth of field as long as you've got a subject that is pretty close to the lens. The bigger difference between f2.8 and f4 is the light gathering capability. Unless you are doing a lot of event work that you can't control the light or that you can't add lights to, that's where the f2.8 might make some sense for you. But for anybody else, I think this is a really great alternative. I almost forgot. As I was editing this video, I remembered at the last second the Elgato Green Screen Plus. Like a lot of the other things in this video, a green screen is something that I always wanted to get, just wasn't the highest priority. There's so many different options for green screens, and I have such a small space and setting up things can be such a hassle in here. I wanted something that was really dead simple to use, and I didn't even know like the Elgato Green Screen Plus, I think that's what this one is called. It's the large one. There's actually a new product that came out in 2023, I believe. So they've had a green screen for years and years, but this one is much wider. I would definitely recommend getting this one if you've got the room for it. It's actually lighter than their older one. It's got improvements in terms of how it's set up. You just pull out this and slide that up, and then you unlatch this, and then you just hook this on here. You can just raise up this pole as high as you need it to go. I'm not gonna raise it up anymore. Well, you know what? Here, try to reach over the top. It's not the best way to do this, but it goes much higher, but that's as high as I can reach. Thought it would be a lot easier to pull a good key than it is. I'd done a little bit of green screen, not very much, like in school and on just some different projects, but there's a lot of things that go into it. The Magic Mask feature in Resolve makes a green screen much less necessary than it was in the past if you want to just cut somebody out and then put a different background on something. That's very processor intensive, and then of course, depending on what shot you're trying to pull yourself out of or pull the subject out of, it might not always work. So if you have the intention of doing a green screen like shot, it's not a bad idea just to go ahead and get a green screen. So there's my list of favorite stuff of 2023. I'd love to know what you tried out in 2023, even if it's not new, something that was new to you that you particularly enjoyed, that made things better for you. Just let me know in the comments. And Happy New Year, and hopefully I'll see you in another video.